pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sherry Hamby. Dr. Sherry Hamby is Distinguished Research Professor of Psychology at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. She's also the director of the Life Path Research Center. Sherry is also founder and co-chair of a wonderful organization called ResilienceCon, which I urge you to go and take a look at and learn about it. They do a phenomenal job supporting resiliency research and the development of new scholars working on resilience. You have more information about Sherry and her work in the chat, and you can go to the website too, where some of her work and her previous presentations have also been archived. So I'll leave you now with Sherry, who will be talking with you about mindfulness research and strategies to foster resilience at school. Sherry, you're mute. There you go. All right. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Etienne. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to be here today. I'm pleased to join all of you. I'm going to share my screen. So because we're talking about mindfulness in this session, and maybe this is a good topic to be after lunch, I thought we would do some brief mindfulness interludes as part of this session, and I'd like to start with just a few minutes to mindfully explore what mindfulness means. And so if you can just get comfortable in your chair, if you're seated or if you're standing, that's fine as well. Just take a moment to adjust your seat so that you are balanced in your chair, or balanced on both legs if you're standing. Uncross your legs. Like sit up with straighten your posture, but when we straighten our posture, we're not aiming for stick straight, because we're not sticks. So we do have a little bit of a natural arch in our back, and you don't want to try to get rid of that. But if you do, just like a little shifting from right to left will often help you get that balance and find that natural arch. Sometimes you can raise your shoulders and let them drop, and that can help you find your posture. And then if you just lift your chin ever so slightly, that will help align your upper spinal cord along your neck with the rest of your back. And once you're in that position, you might already start to feel a little energized, or feel the energy flow through you better, and you're unkinked. But if not, just take this moment to take a few deep breaths. Audible exhale can help you get in touch with your breath. Breath is an important component of mindfulness, something that's always with us. You might hear mindfulness practitioners refer to our friend, the breath. And our breath is always there as an opportunity and an invitation to return to this present moment. As you breathe, you might start to notice some of the sensations that are accompanying that. For example, Might notice that your air feels cool as it goes in through your nostrils. And then if you exhale through your mouth, you can feel how your body has warmed it ever so slightly, even on that quick trip through your lungs. Might start to notice your chest and your diaphragm and your belly expanding. Our whole body participates in the breath. One of the big, challenges and blessings both, I suppose, of mindfulness is that it invites you to just stay focused in the present. That can be hard for many of us to do. My mind wanders, certainly. I have other things on my mind, other tasks, people I need to get back in touch with, plans for the weekend, picking up your children. There's probably all manner of things on your mind. And it's an important element of mindfulness to appreciate that the goal is not to push all those thoughts away and reject them. In fact, the goal of mindfulness is just the opposite of that. It is this radical acceptance. So it's time to try to put our inner critics aside. This is a long process. I'm still working on it myself. But metaphors you'll hear a lot in mindfulness, or just to think of all those thoughts as leaves floating down a stream. There's no need to have a strong emotional response to them or to tell yourself you're doing it wrong. Just notice, oh yes, I'm, still thinking about that deadline or just observe it and let it float down the stream. And then always bring your focus back to the breath. Jack Kornfield, who was one of the most prominent mindfulness practitioners in the US, he's the founder of Spirit Rock out in California. He has a metaphor that I like for our wandering attention. He likes to think of it as a puppy. So when your attention wanders, just think of it as a puppy. I love dogs, so this is a metaphor that works really well for me. If you don't love dogs, then you can use the leaf or something else. It doesn't have to be the puppy. But for me, it's hard to get mad at a puppy. And so if I think about my wandering attention as a puppy, then as he suggests, I can just go get the puppy, pick the puppy up, bring the puppy back, just over and over. There's nothing wrong with your wandering attention. It's just a puppy that needs to be brought back to the moment. We'll try a couple of other mindfulness techniques scattered throughout this session. For now, I would invite you to open your eyes if you had them closed and come back to the slides here. So we're going to talk just briefly about the 4 ways to help people, because I've found that that's a useful way of understanding this call for shifting to more strengths-based approaches and learning to, it's quite a big mindset. I mean, I got trained in clinical psychology in the 80s and 90s, and it was a very deficit-based approach to helping people that was mostly focused on symptom removal and problems inside people and not so much in their environment. But there are ways to think about nudging the environment so that we promote everybody's well-being in much more strengths-based and proactive ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to make that mental shift And then in addition to mindfulness, I'm going to just introduce you briefly to a couple of tools for learning how to think about our environments as sources for promoting resilience among children. And we're going to be focusing on school examples today, but honestly, these would apply to many different settings as well. So the resilience portfolio model that I developed with Vicki Banyard and John Gritch, one of the great things it does is it really integrates all of the things that we might do as teachers or as counselors or as social workers or whatever our role is into basically 4 buckets. And I think it also provides a way of thinking about why some of our traditional buckets are maybe ones that we should rely on a little bit less and shift to these more strengths-based approaches. So the first bucket is that we can increase coping responses. And that would be giving people more resources and assets and trying to use that and increase their strengths so that they increase their coping. So in a classic cognitive behavioral therapy framework, this could include increasing positive self-talk. This could also include something like putting people on medication or just generally any kind of self-disclosure or help seeking. The second bucket is to change people's coping responses. So sometimes, for example, if somebody's usual coping strategy is to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs, well, you don't want to increase that coping response. You want to switch that out for something that's going to be healthier and more successful. So this could include something, I mean, like in cognitive behavioral therapy, quite a lot of things would fall into this bucket. So for example, cognitive restructuring and trying to change biased cognitions like catastrophizing or black and white thinking and substituting more rational analyses. Or if you're in a more insight-oriented framework, shifting from primitive defense mechanisms like projection and denial to more sophisticated ones. What I'm going to be mostly talking about today is neither of those, although pretty much all traditional psychotherapy probably goes in those buckets, and thinking more about working directly on promoting well-being. So mindfulness, exercise, yoga, forest bathing, gardening, all the environmental nudges that we're going to be talking about, they're not so much about whatever our problem is, if it's bullying or child abuse or anything like that. They're just direct tools to help make us feel better. And there's increasing evidence, which I'll talk just briefly about some of it, that this is more effective than some of our traditional therapeutic approaches. And I think you can see that from even looking at these models, because the only reason that changing your coping responses works is if all of these other arrows are going to follow this system too. So the connection between adversity and coping, and then strengths improving the coping responses, and then the coping responses contributing to your well-being. So it's actually a much more complicated process than just this one, where we're just going to do things to make people feel better and not necessarily talk about the trauma or the violence or whatever. And this is really a pretty radically different approach to thinking about what makes people feel better when they've had difficult experiences in life. And then the fourth one, which we're not going to be talking about today, but if you are interested in it, I wrote a whole book about it with Vicki Banyard that came out last year. And that is that the insulating effect, because when you increase people's resources and assets, one of the things that you're going to do is also insulate them or prevent some of their exposure to adversity. We probably can't prevent all exposure to adversity. I mean, there's the pandemic, there's climate change, there's a lot of things that are out of our control, but it certainly will minimize exposure to a lot of especially more interpersonal based adversities by taking more strengths-based approaches as well. So when I talk about resilience, as Sewanee asked me to do today, I define that as the process of achieving well-being and thriving after adversity, by harnessing all of your assets and resources. So that's what I mean by strengths, like all of your psychosocial strengths to counter the effects. And we are a big believer in what we call a portfolio approach, which is a social ecological approach that includes lots of different kinds of strengths that you can use in lots of different situations. So we are not big fans of some of the people out there who have really zeroed in on just one strength like grit, or just a very small set of strengths as the key to overcoming trauma. I think it's going to vary a lot for different situations, and then it's better to have a diverse portfolio or a diverse toolkit of strengths to cope with different adversities. And then I would also want to say, and if we had more time, I would go into this in more detail, but this is different from the way that people often talk about resilience, especially in the media or among the general public, which sometimes they talk about as if it's a personality characteristic or an individual trait, which not only I think can be very victim blaming, but also I think it's really unfair to probably everybody here, and probably almost everyone, but especially those of us who have committed ourselves to some kind of helping profession, because that individual approach doesn't really leave any room to acknowledge all of the things that other people do to help overcome trauma. And most of us, even dealing with our own adversities, probably would not be where we are today without the help of others. So we're really strongly opposed to individualistic approaches to thinking about resilience. And that helps bring us to nudges. So this is one of the ideas I hope to leave you with today. And the idea behind nudges is that you can tweak the environment instead of admonishing people. And this was an idea developed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And there's small environmental shifts. So in one of the examples from them, when they wanted it's like changing what's available at the checkout line in the grocery store so that there's less candy and more healthier choices. So instead of just telling kids don't eat so much candy and then just putting signals to eat candy around them all the time, the nudge approach is like, well, let's get rid of some of these signals to eat candy and put, fruit or other healthier choices at eye level in these grocery checkout lines, so that we're not both, sending essentially contradictory messages. In another famous example, there was an airport in Amsterdam that was having problems with what they were delicately calling spillage in the men's bathroom. Now, a typical admonishment approach, which is what a lot of prevention and intervention is organized around, would be like, don't make a mess in this bathroom, or even polite versions of that are still basically putting all the responsibility on every single solitary individual person to solve that problem without thinking about the systemic problems. So in airports, and I thought this was a good example because sometimes it helps to think outside of your own environment a little bit. And I think airports actually have a lot in common with schools, in that they're busy campuses that are shifting people around from place to place a lot. And people in airports are tired, they're stressed, they probably don't feel a sense of ownership over the space. So you can't take all of that away, but you can switch to incentivizing what you want people to do. And so the idea that these people came up with is that they took a little sticker of a fly and put it at the bottom of the urinals and gave men something to aim at. And this had a dramatic effect on reducing the problem of spillage that they were having in these bathroom problems. And I think it's a shift in thinking, and I know that's just a very small example, but I think it's a shift in thinking that is a very powerful alternative from our traditional ways of thinking about how to deal with behavior problems. Another famous aspect of nudges are understanding choice architecture and the power of default settings. So for example, like opting into retirement accounts automatically when you get a job, instead of making you opt in as an optional thing. If the optional thing is to opt out, then people save much more money. And so there's lots of other examples of things like that. And I think also the idea about nudges is to try to make it seem more fun and engaging to do what people want you to do. And so I love this example, which came from a school cafeteria at a university, so a little bit older, but still much the same circumstance. And they were trying to get people to eat more vegetables. And so they kept serving the same dish all the way through this experiment. But in some cases, they gave him these very healthy labels, and some of them even made it sound like lower cal. So like carrots with sugar-free citrus dressing, or Smart Choice vitamin C citrus carrots, versus indulgent labels like twisted citrus glazed carrots, or just basically a plain label that just said carrots. And you might be surprised to learn that the healthy labels actually led to less carrot eating than just calling them carrots and nothing else. And the one that by far led to the most carrot eating was the indulgent label, the twisted citrus glazed carrots, even though that was the exact same preparation as the carrots with sugar-free citrus dressing. So I think it's also important that we shouldn't be pushing back against human nature when we try to think about how to support thriving and well-being and good behavior in schools or other systems like that. And we like things that sound enjoyable. We don't like things that sound really virtuous and restricted. And so even though it might not seem like it, I think that mindfulness is actually a terrific example of that. In the book that we wrote on prevention, this is one of the things that we really strongly advocate for: violence prevention. Most youth violence prevention programs have really poor outcomes. They're in the effect size range. So in terms of like how much you're moving them, most of them are in a range that's about 0.1 standard deviations above where you were. So that's actually a very small baby step. And mindfulness, without talking about the goal of reducing aggression or anything at all, actually has an impact of about half a standard deviation, which that's really a pretty good size step forward from baseline for kids. This was based on young children and adolescents, and almost all of this research was done in school settings in this big meta-analysis by Tao, and it is showing impact sizes that are 4 or 5 times than even the best established violence prevention programs, which mostly use admonishment strategies about it's not nice to hit and things like that, that really don't have any impact, noticeable impact, especially long-term on people at all. But mindfulness has also been shown to have many other positive benefits. It has improved meaning making. And this is a meta-analysis that a student of mine and I did a couple of years ago, looking at randomized controlled trials of various different interventions for promoting meaning making, because we have found that that's one of the strengths that is most important for helping people reach a true sense of thriving after violence or other adversity. And mindfulness won that one too. It beat psychotherapy and it beat psychoeducation and a bunch of other types of interventions. And then Goldberg et al. Did another meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a mathematical way of averaging the outcomes across a whole bunch of different studies, so that if somebody got really lucky or really unlucky on any particular paper, you're not relying on just the results of one single study, but you're looking at the average across a whole bunch of studies. And so it's a much better way of finding out what the true impact of a program is. And they also found a very promising impact on various people experiencing various psychological disorders. And perhaps most impressively out of all of these, another meta-analysis compared more than 400 research evaluations of interventions to promote well-being. And mindfulness came out number 1 in that one too. And what was really interesting about that study is that you could almost see the results going in terms of how much mindfulness was a component of the other interventions they looked at. So after straight mindfulness, the one that came out next best after that was ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, Steve Hayes therapy, which for those of you who are familiar with it, you might know has a really huge dose of mindfulness in it. In fact, acceptance and commitment is basically named after some of the principles of mindfulness. And then dialectical behavior therapy, Marsha Linehan's therapy, all came out next. And so that one also has a number of mindfulness techniques in it, like grounding and things like that, but it also has some more traditional CBT, and then CBT, traditional CBT was below all of those. So you could see almost this dose response effect in terms of how much mindfulness was emphasized in an intervention with how big the impact was. And, I think in hindsight, this is something that perhaps we should have predicted, because this practice has been around for at least 2,500 years. And when I was young and it was first coming to the United States, people really talked about it as if it was this very flaky and weird thing. But now that we've got hundreds of randomized controlled trials that really show that it, in fact, is a very powerful intervention. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it is really important. And I think a common mistake in the way that some people use mindfulness interventions is that it's not about forcing yourself to relax or pay better attention. It's really about accepting your thoughts and feelings without judgment and just trying to bring yourself back to that center. And schools are such a great environment for doing mindfulness interventions, because an important part of mindfulness is Sangha, or being part of a mindful, loving kindness community. And so it is possible. I mean, obviously there are dozens of apps, or maybe hundreds, who knows, for mindfulness and things like that. So you can certainly practice it as a single person, but to get the full benefits of mindfulness, there is really nothing about like being part of a mindfulness community, and the classroom would offer a terrific environment for that. There are a number of types of mindfulness meditations. There's one that focuses on metta, or loving kindness, which is a key element of Buddhist traditions. There's some that focus on body scans, some focus on gratitude. We've already talked about how many of them have an element of focusing on the breath. There's also walking meditations, which I think for many of us that we often feel like our bodies, especially those of us who are, spend a lot of time in schools and university settings, or even if we were just really good students with ourselves, that we can kind of think of ourselves from the neck up, and that a lot of our identity focuses on the neck up, and our bodies are almost just contraptions for moving our head around. But mindfulness walking meditation is supposed to help you get more in touch with yourself as an entire body, and to realize that you're just as much your hand and your belly and your heart as you are your head. That can be a powerful approach to meditation too. That is certainly something that can be used with students. One of the things that is also really terrific about mindfulness is that it's easy and accessible. You don't need a licensed practitioner to do a mindfulness program. There are, I have sent these slides to the Melissa Institute, so maybe they can share these links with you. And perhaps one of the things that I really like best about it is that it doesn't matter if you're very good at it. I don't think of myself as an expert mindfulness practitioner. As I said, my mind certainly wanders a lot, but you don't have to be really terrific at it in order to derive some benefit from it. And one of my mantras for thinking about any kind of program that you want to offer is that if it's easy to screw up, it's going to be hard to scale up. And so some of the intervention programs we have out there that require highly trained and skilled licensed providers, those often do not show the same results when the people who founded those programs, when they get extended to other people implementing them. And one of the real problems we have in the field is that a lot of our prevention and intervention programs don't replicate very well. But of course, the people who develop mindfulness are long gone. And in all of these different studies, it's just a whole range of different labs and teams that are all finding similarly positive results. So it is a very scalable intervention. In terms of incorporating mindfulness into school spaces, you can begin or end each school day. I do think you have to not rush that along. It's better to do 1 or 2 minutes. That is really just a calm couple of deep breaths than it is to do like 5 minutes and try to rush through some script or something like that. But you can see, I mean, here, I did it here. I've integrated mindfulness into this space, into this webinar space that's super easy to do. You can create a labyrinth on your school grounds. You can make it part of assemblies. A lot of athletic teams use mindfulness. You can make it part of band or theater rehearsals. For students who are on IEPs, who are on individualized education programs, you could add a daily meditation practice as part of that, which probably have terrific benefits for many of them. Or you can incorporate meditative activities into other spaces, like assigning mandalas in art class, which so that there's a space to be more meditative in classroom settings outside of specific meditations. And then also, I think it's equally important to think about how you can incorporate it into professional spaces. So don't just think about your students, but think about yourselves. So staff meetings, maybe starting teacher work days with that, or advocating for mindfulness retreats to qualify for professional development resources in a school district or another institution. And with that, I'm going to pause again and do another mindfulness interlude. And this one will be just a very short introduction to loving kindness meditation. So once again, if you can just, like even in that short period of time, my posture has deteriorated a little bit. So perhaps yours has as well. Once again, just settle into taking some nice deep breaths, uncrossing your legs. You can either close your eyes or you can also just look with the soft downward gaze if you prefer. I do usually offer both of those options because, especially if you work with people who have extensive trauma histories, some of them are not comfortable closing their eyes, and it's not necessary at all. Any accommodation that needs to be made for mobility or consideration of other issues is fine. There's many ways to meditate. And in a loving kindness meditation, probably the most common ones start with just a moment of acknowledgement of loving kindness for yourself. Think about all the work you do. Probably everybody who's on this call today has a mission of trying to reduce the burden of trauma and promote well-being of school children and others in the world. But just take a moment and offer a moment of loving kindness for yourself and all that you do to try to make your community a better place. And then we expand outward. Think about our closer social networks. Think about our loved ones and our family members. I'd like to express some loving kindness toward Sewanee and everybody affiliated with the Melissa Institute for creating this space today. Maybe you have colleagues or family members who have helped to make it possible for you to be here today. Maybe someone's picking up your kids from school for you, or covering the phones at your office, whatever the case may be. So I can send a moment of loving kindness for all the people who support you and your work and your loved ones. And then we usually expand the circle greater. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump up a little bit and just jump to everyone in your community or in your state or in your country. Been through some difficult times lately, pandemic, school violence, a lot of tragedies seem to have become part of our daily lives, and just send the moments, just some vibes of loving kindness out to everyone. We're trying to get through these difficult times as best they can. And then lastly, let's just stretch out one more ring to include all the living creatures of the world. Many of them are under strain as well from climate change or environmental loss, but they're also trying to make their contribution and send a moment of loving kindness to all living creatures everywhere. And take one last deep breath. An audible exhale through your mouth, and then you can return when you want. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to think about back more to the environmental side of nudges, and so to think about the built and natural environments as tools for fostering resilience and preventing trauma. The advantage of thinking about these is that they can have impact on everybody in a community at one time. So if we stick with our example of a school campus, on the children, on the teachers, on the other staff members, on the parents who interact with the school, with everybody who comes into contact with that space. And so the first tool I want to recommend to you is an assessment tool, because I think this is a great way to start if you're trying to shift gears to learning to think more systemically. And there are several tools out there. They're all very similar to each other. They go by names like hotspot mapping, geographic interviewing, and walk audits. The insight behind things like hotspot mapping and geographic interviewing is that the problems that we see in a school campus or any other like physical community is they're not evenly distributed. So for example, bullying, that's probably not happening all that much in the middle of English class. It's probably a much bigger problem in the cafeteria, in the bathroom, on the playground, on the school bus. And so the idea behind hotspot mapping is that this might vary somewhat from school to school. Maybe one place it's more problem on the buses and the others on the cafeteria, and that this helps you identify the critical spaces in your setting and focus on those. Geographic interviewing is a very similar idea, and this is one that was used in a residential facility for young adults, but it can ask about questions other than safety or danger, but also asking about things like, where do you feel most connected? So that's another twist on the same idea. And some of the things I really love about hotspot mapping and geographic interviewing is that they don't require any history of victimization or perpetration. And perhaps even more importantly, they don't require any kind of self-disclosure or reporting on others. All you have to know is where the dangerous places in the schools are. And maybe, you as a particular student or even a teacher might know how to avoid those. That still doesn't mean that you don't have useful information about it. So it takes some of the burden off of victims to have to come forward. One of the examples it was Bruce Taylor and Nan Stein, who first probably used this in violence prevention, an area close to my work. And in one of the schools, people kept putting in red the safety resource officer desk. And when they investigated that, they realized that one of the safety resource officers was in fact, preying on some of the young girls in the school. And nobody had been able to come forward with that because of the circumstances of the offenses. But lots of people knew that this was a very dangerous person. And so this hotspot mapping provided this very safe way for people to come forward. And then they were really able to make a big difference in that school by identifying that person and getting them out of the school. And then so sometimes you might have to, especially if it's an adult perpetrator, you might have to remove the person. But the main idea behind hotspots is to think about changing the environment. So for example, if the cafeteria is a red zone in your particular school, then you might think about rearranging the seating or rearranging the traffic flow or the schedule of who eats when. So maybe all the fifth graders shouldn't be eating lunch at the same time. Maybe it'd be better to split them up and pair them with the kindergartners so that there's, probably less cross-grade bullying. You might try to include the number of other adults that are in the cafeteria. In terms of traffic flow, one example I love came from a colleague of mine who was on the school board in a county in Washington State. And because of COVID, like probably in many schools, they changed the traffic flow in their school so that all the hallways were just one way. And what that meant is that there weren't kids passing each other in the hall anymore. And because of this particular county, they kept quite good track of fights and things like that. They realized that changing the traffic flow to one way was having a big impact on reducing fights in their school, because if two classes are passing each other, then that's 30 or whatever number of instances where they could possibly get into a conflict with each other. But if you're all just walking in one direction single file, then the only potential to get in a conflict is with the person in front of you and the person behind you. So there are environmental changes we can make that being powerful impacts that don't end up focusing so much on kids and labeling some kids as problematic or letting some kids get victimized or whatever. So the idea is to really focus about building level or campus level alterations and not identifying particular kids as either as victims or as perpetrators. The walk audit is basically the same idea. And I know I'm going through this a little bit quickly, but I was trying to whet your appetite, hopefully, for these ideas. And then it just means going around and experiencing the professional spaces that you are in, through the school campus or whatever it is, and trying to identify it in a more mobile and interactive way. Again, I'm not going to go through all these questions in the interest of time, but the slides can be available from the Melissa Institute. But I do just want to show you one example of one thing that got changed recently at my own university, is that we worked for more than a year to distill the core values of our university. I was part of that committee. And one of the things that they have done is that they invested in these signs to better communicate our values and to make it it's easier for people to remember them and to learn them and just to be reinforced by them. And, I do want to just acknowledge very briefly that this is a process. I mean, my university is not perfect, like I don't think very many institutions are, and we don't always perfectly embody these values in the way that I personally would like to see, but it has really changed a lot of conversations on campus to make them more visible, and they've become frames of reference for lots of different initiatives on campus, and I hope that that will continue to improve. And I do think that making them very visible part of the campus, like literally a visible part of the campus, has been a big part of the reason that they've had an impact. And then going back again to like the classic nudges, this is from another study where they moved the location of the salad bar and greatly increased how many kids were getting salads at lunchtime. And so those can also be good examples of trying to think about subtle changes you can make to promote better behavior. And then the last approach I want to leave you with is to think about the natural environment. And there are, again, like with mindfulness, I think one of the reasons I have focused on these particular ones is because there have been multiple different avenues of research that are all kind of ending up in the same point. So in Japan, this is where the idea of Shinrin-yoku, that's a Japanese phrase, and it loosely translates into forest bathing, but it really just means like hanging out in natural environments, and you don't even have to be hiking or anything like that. There's also research on gardening. There has been quite a lot of research on greening spaces and how greening urban spaces can reduce violence for whole communities. And then there's even been like this study under this third bullet here. This was kind of an interesting study. These are exercise physiologists, so they're pretty far afield from psychology in some ways, but they kind of recreated this hike on a treadmill so that the steepness and the length of it and everything were exactly matched, like step for step, about what it was like through the woods. And they found that there was more benefits from actually doing the walk in the woods in a natural environment than getting an identical amount of exercise in an urban environment on a treadmill. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's been done in this, and all of it basically says that almost any exposure that we have to greener environments will improve the well-being of the whole community. And there are some this is way outside my own area of research, but there is some pretty interesting research about different kinds of organic compounds like phytoncides or bacteria that might be boosting our immune systems and things like that are explaining some of the changes that are happening from our contact with nature. And this is also something that is just super easy and low cost and doesn't require a licensed psychologist or anything like that to improve school spaces. You can just bring plants into classrooms, and I've put a couple of examples of ones that are pretty hard to kill out there. Even putting outdoor benches on the school grounds or promoting gardening with the students in different ways. Improving the landscaping around the school grounds. Here at my local elementary school, we have a couple of days every summer, but a little bit before the school year starts, where they have a beautification day, and people from the community just come out and help with the landscaping. And I think that it's been, it's good for all those volunteers, and it's good to have the school look nice when the students come back to it. And then another thing that they're doing in our local school districts, which are also nice evidence-based spaces, are they're investing money in building outdoor platforms and gazebos so that they can do more of their science and theater and other programming outside. I am not going to cover these today in the interest of time, but just in terms of other recommended strategies, there's this mentoring, photo voice, and narrative, or some others that I'm big fans of. And then I just want to leave with what will be a very quick body scan. I think that I'm going to do an active body scan because I think this is a good one that you can do even with very small, very fidgety little kids. So just one last time, just find that balanced seat or standing position. You can certainly do this standing too, and settle back into your breath for the moment. And an active body scan, the idea behind that is because so many of us are sort of out of touch with our bodies, is just to create that more noticeable contrast between tension and relaxation, so that we start to recognize a little bit more readily when we are tensing up and unconsciously and may not know it. So if you start with your feet, just scrunch your feet up for a moment, scrunch your toes in your shoes if you can, and then just relax. And then just observe any differences. There's no right or wrong differences, but just notice them. And then come up to your legs. If you're seated, you might want to stick your feet out in front of you. You can push through your heels a little bit and feel the hamstrings behind you, and point with your toes, and then feel that stretch the muscles along the tops of your leg. And then relax, maybe even just give your legs a little shake. Feel the difference there. With your back, you don't want people to clench their back, because some people might have lower back conditions or something. So what can be good is just to do a little gentle twist. Just reach your left arm across your body and grab your chair, or if you're standing, just rest it on a back of a chair or a bookcase or something, and then just twist low at the torso. Don't push on your shoulders and neck, just let them follow your twist, and then come back to center, and then do the other side. It's important to always do both sides. So now take your right arm over to your outer left leg or your left arm of your chair, and twist gently that way. Keep breathing all the way through. Then you can raise up your shoulders, let those go. Make, fist with your arms. Let that go, and then just give your hands a shake and let all that tension flow out of your fingers, flow down your legs and off into the earth, where it will hold it for you. For your neck, you can just lower it, and don't do a whole 360 neck roll, but you can do a 180 from shoulder to shoulder in one direction and then the other. And then just can end by scrunching up your face and stretching your jaw. A lot of us hold tension in our jaw. Then just relaxing again. This has been kind of a short body scan, but you still might notice as you settle back into your breath, which is always there for us, that you might feel a little bit differently, having just invited all those muscles to relax. Take a last couple of deep breaths. And I will close there. My last thought that I will leave with you is that for many years, people thought that resilient people were like unicorns, that they were remarkable and rare. But it turns out that resilient people are like squirrels we're really everywhere. It is so many pathways that we can use to recover from any adversity or trauma that we've experienced. And I hope that you'll find some of these suggestions useful. And I thank you very much for your time.